Hello, welcome to this edition of Thoughts of a Whole Brain Man. And today, looking at some sociological history with a possibility of an optimistic future for humanity. And I'm an autistic person, and I wouldn't say such things lightly. There is a Harvard professor of psychology called Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker writes wonderful books on psychology in such a fashion that they're palatable and digestible for the general public. One of his books that came out about 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, was this. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. The Better Angels of Our Nature. The Decline of Violence in History and Its Causes. Yeah, I did say that. The decline of violence. Whoa, hold on a minute. I look at the newspapers and I look at the news on the TV and, decline of violence? Seriously, Gaza, Ukraine, Darfur, Sudan, decline of violence? What's happening in the street? The knife crime in the cities, the gun crime in the schools. How on earth can you say the decline of violence? But Pinker, one day, was reading this. It's by Elias. It's called The Civilizing Influence. And it's a book that describes hominoids, us, as adapted creatures. We are adapted apes, right? So, for example, all mammals create spittle. Think of a slobbering bloodhound, a camel, right? We all do that. We're mammals. But in human societies, it's very often taboo. It's taboo to release your spittle randomly. Could you imagine if everybody just dribbled, standing in a queue in a shop or, yes. It would put you off your fish and chips if you were in the queue and someone was drooling and dribbling or spitting it out when they talk. There have been certain cultural contexts where it was okay. I once had a conversation with a chap who was once a roadie for The Clash, and he was describing the state of the equipment after a show. But in usual contexts, spitting is taboo for a variety of reasons. And that means that human beings, as creatures, when we're small, we're taught to adapt that. We're taught to only spit in certain contexts, into a handkerchief, for example, right? So that's part of the civilizing process, the adaptations we make to our biological instincts in order to comply and fit with society, because we are relational beings. And this got Pinker to start thinking. So he did some research, and he went back about 1,000 odd years, globally, looking at societies over 1,000 years of history, and he started to notice some patterns. And the patterns that he noticed wasn't that human beings are becoming less violent as such, but they're becoming increasingly intolerant of violence. Now, obviously, when you look at the research, you're looking back at earlier versions of ourselves, more savage versions of ourselves. And in order to understand the difference of where we were compared to where we are, you have to look at where we were. And that means you are reading things like how disabled people would be chained up in barns, or how people in medieval Britain would torture cats in taverns, or, quite famously, street urchins would be hung for stealing bread and things like this. But just on that kind of basis, in terms of society's relationship with violence, we are becoming increasingly intolerant of it. That's not the same thing as saying there is less violence. That's not the same thing as saying that human beings are no longer violent, but just our attitude towards it is changing. And attitude creates behavior. So over time, there is, in a sense, less of it, with spikes that happen, obviously. One measure of this is capital punishment. If you look across, say, the last 200 years of history globally, you'll find that there's been an increasing rate of countries repealing capital punishment. So fewer and fewer and fewer countries have what could be described as judicial murder. There's still some of it about in certain parts of the world, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as it used to be. It's not that long ago that it was very common and ordinary for a person to walk around with a long sword up their belt, or a flintlock pistol, in doubloon trousers with extra kind of long pockets. That was quite commonplace. If you read Sherlock Holmes, you find Dr. Watson carries a gun. If he hasn't got a license, you didn't need one then. Licensing and things like that was something that came out of a desire to adjust and adapt and control the usage of that invention. You can't uninvent something, but you can create restrictions, you can create procedure, you can create a culture of usage. And so the laws around those sorts of things have grown up in the last 100 years or so. Interesting stuff. And in a sense, this book that sounds very optimistic on the surface, The Better Angels of Our Nature, the decline of violence, its history and its causes of that decline. Well, I mean, seriously? Really? Actually, yes. Because this is well researched and the research is documented, and it's all of it is referenced, and you can follow the paper trail. You can look it up. If you ever find that you're getting in despair about the world and the state of the world, and you like a sense of hope, not fanciful hope, not some kind of mystical guru hope, not a daydreamer's hope, not a wishful thinking hope, but a factual hope based on evidence and research. This is researched optimism. Seriously. When you read this and you follow the train of thought that describes how we are changing over time, it's slow. Yes, it is slow. Wilberforce proposed that this island, Great Britain, become the first place to outlaw slavery more than 250 years ago now, right? And there are still people enslaved in cities in the UK. The notion that it is outlawed isn't being followed through completely with our behaviours. But then that's why we've got laws about all sorts of things: speeding in your car, hitting people on the head. All of these things are against the law, yet people do them, right? But the notion of them being no longer tolerated, that's a thing. So history moves slowly, right? And quite often in our lives, we have a bit of a sense maybe of history, maybe decade or 20 years back, 30 years back, depending on your age. You might have a bit of a notion of the next year or how the next 3 or 4 or 5 years might look up ahead. But for the most part, we live in these little short bubbles of time, right? So when you get an opportunity to stretch that out and look back and actually see progress over a long period of time, there's an orientation of trajectory, and the orientation of the sense of human beings globally is that we humans are becoming increasingly intolerant of violence. Researched. Seriously, get yourself a copy of this. If you need a bit of hope, real hope, this has got it. Thank you for your time. I'll see you again, hopefully, in these thoughts of a whole brain man. Thank you.